Camp Concordia, Kansas. November 24th, 1943. Snow fell light as ash across the parade grounds, settling on wire fences and guard towers. Inside the mess hall, 300 German prisoners stood in formation, waiting for orders, expecting the usual evening ration-thin soup, hard bread, perhaps potatoes if supplies permitted. Instead, they smelled turkey. Roasting turkey, sage and butter, sweetness like nothing they'd known in years of war. Sergeant James Holland stood at the door, grinning. Thanksgiving dinner, boys. American tradition. You'll eat till you can't walk. The prisoners exchanged glances, uncertain whether this was kindness or some elaborate American cruelty they couldn't yet comprehend. The doors opened. Warmth poured out from the mess hall, carrying scents that made grown men stop breathing. Wilhelm Fischer was the first to enter. 26 years old, captured in Tunisia 8 months earlier. He had spent those months expecting the worst starvation rations, forced labor, maybe violence. What he'd received instead was adequate food, clean barracks, work details that paid a small wage. But nothing had prepared him for this. The mess hall had been transformed. Long tables covered in white cloth, actual cloth, not paper. Plates and silverware, not the metal trays they usually used. And at the far end, on a serving line that stretched the entire width of the room, food. So much food. Wilhelm stopped walking. Behind him, Ernst Becker nearly collided with his back. Then Ernst saw what Wilhelm was seeing, and he stopped too. Within seconds, the entire line of prisoners had frozen, staring at the impossible abundance before them. Whole turkeys, golden brown, steam rising from their crisp skin. Mashed potatoes in mountains, butter melting into valleys, gravy in enormous metal containers, dark and rich. Stuffing bread and herbs and sausage mixed together in a combination Wilhelm had never seen. Sweet potatoes with something caramelized on top. Green beans, cranberry sauce, bright red and gelatinous. Rolls, soft and white, stacked in baskets. And at the end of the line, visible even from the entrance, pies. Apple pies, pumpkin pies, more pies than Wilhelm could count. "Move along," Sergeant Holland called out, but his voice carried no harshness. Plenty for everyone. No need to rush. The prisoners moved forward slowly, as if approaching something that might vanish if they moved too quickly. Wilhelm picked up a plate, actual ceramic, not metal, and stepped to the first station. An American private, maybe 19 years old, stood behind the turkey carving station. He looked at Wilhelm and smiled. White meat or dark? Wilhelm didn't understand the question. He spoke some English, learned in school before the war, but the dialect confused him. Breast or leg? The private tried again, gesturing. Leg, Wilhelm said quietly. The private carved a massive piece of turkey, thigh, and drumstick together and placed it on Wilhelm's plate. It took up half the ceramic surface. Then the private added 2 slices of breast meat on top. Wilhelm stared. This was more meat than he'd seen in a single serving since 1940. Plenty more where that came from, the private said cheerfully. You want seconds. You come right back. Wilhelm moved to the next station. Potatoes. The server another. American soldier scooped a portion so large, threatened to slide off the plate. Then gravy over everything. Then stuffing. Then sweet potatoes. Then beans. Then cranberry sauce, which Wilhelm had never seen before and couldn't identify. By the time he reached the end of the serving line, his plate weighed more than the packs they'd carried on forced marshes. He found a seat at one of the white-clothed tables and set the plate down carefully, as if it might break. Ernst sat across from him, his own plate equally loaded. They looked at each other, then at their food, then back at each other. This is propaganda, Ernst whispered in German. They're showing us abundance to break our morale. Or, Wilhelm said quietly, maybe this is just what they do. Around them, 300 German prisoners filled the mess hall, each carrying plates piled impossibly high with food. The American guards sat at tables among them, their own plates identical, eating and talking as if this were ordinary. As if feeding your prisoners the same feast you ate yourself was normal. Wilhelm picked up his fork. He cut a piece of turkey. The meat was tender, falling apart at the touch, seasoned with salt and pepper and something herbal he couldn't name. He put it in his mouth and chewed slowly. The taste was overwhelming. Not because it was exotic turkey existed in Germany, though he'd rarely eaten it, but because it was good, really good. Cooked with care, seasoned properly, served hot and abundant. It was food given without resentment, without the calculation of minimum necessary calories, without the sense that every bite was grudgingly provided. He swallowed, then he cut another piece, then another. Around him, a sound of 300 men eating filled the mess hall. No one spoke. The only sounds were silverware on ceramic, chewing, swallowing, the occasional scrape of a chair. It wasn't quite silence, it was something deeper. A kind of stunned, disbelieving focus that came from hunger meeting abundance after years of deprivation. Sergeant Holland stood near the kitchen door, watching. Lieutenant Patricia Wells, the mess officer who had organized the dinner, stood beside him. "They're not talking," she observed. "Would you?" Holland asked. "If you'd been hungry for 3 years, and someone gave you this?" "I suppose not." They watched as prisoners finished their first plates, and hesitantly began returning to the serving line. The servers loaded their plates again, without comment, without judgment, as if seconds were not just permitted, but expected. Wilhelm went back for more turkey. He couldn't help himself. The first plate had awakened something in him, not just hunger, which he'd learned to manage, but a deeper need he hadn't realized existed. The need for food that wasn't rationed, that wasn't calculated, that wasn't given with the implicit message that you didn't really deserve it. This food said, "You're hungry. Here's dinner. Eat." It was almost unbearably American. By the time dessert came, servers bringing pies to each table, cutting enormous slices, offering seconds before anyone finished firsts, Wilhelm felt something inside him shift. Not breaking, exactly. More like a wall developing a crack, hairline thin but present. He had been told Americans were soft, decadent, incapable of real sacrifice. He had been told they waged war from comfort, that they didn't understand hardship, that their material abundance made them weak. But sitting in this mess hall, eating pie made by soldiers who had fought in North Africa and Italy, served by men who had lost friends and brothers. To German forces, Wilhelm began to understand something that propaganda had missed. America wasn't weak because it had abundance. It was strong enough to share that abundance, even with enemies. The meal lasted 2 hours. When it finally ended, when the last prisoner had finished his third helping of pie and sat back in his chair, groaning from fullness, Sergeant Holland stood up. "That was Thanksgiving," he announced, "American holiday. We give thanks for what we have. Food, family, peace when we can get it." He paused. "You're prisoners, yes, but you're also men far from home. And on Thanksgiving, everyone eats." "Yes?" No one responded. What could they say? "Thank you for feeding us while we're captive. Thank you for treating us better than we treated your soldiers when we captured them?" Wilhelm walked back to his barracks in silence, Ernst beside him. The November air was cold, the snow still falling lightly. His stomach was uncomfortably full, a sensation he'd nearly forgotten. "That really happened," Ernst said finally. "Yes, they really fed us like that. Yes. Why?" Wilhelm had no answer. The question was too large, too complicated. Why does anyone show mercy to enemies? Why does America, with every reason to be cruel, choose instead to be decent? That night, he wrote a letter to his wife, Anna, still in Hamburg if she was still alive at all. He hadn't heard from her in 6 months. Today was Thanksgiving. he wrote in careful German script. An American holiday I'd never heard of. They served us turkey and potatoes and pie. More food than I've seen in years. The guards ate the same meal we did, at the same tables. I don't know what to make of this place, Anna. Everything I was told about the enemy was wrong. Or maybe not wrong, but incomplete. They're beating us in this war, but not through cruelty. Through something else. Something I'm still trying to understand. He didn't mail the letter. Mail from POW camps was uncertain, and he wasn't sure Anna would believe him anyway. How do you explain abundance to someone starving in a bombed city? November turned to December. The prisoners of Camp Concordia settled into winter routines, work details maintaining the camp, some farm labor when weather permitted, long evenings in the barracks, playing cards or reading books from the small library. Food remained adequate, better than adequate. Hot soup, bread, meat a few times a week. Coffee in the mornings, real coffee, not the ersatz grain mixture they drunk in Germany. Then, in mid-December, rumors started. Christmas was coming, and with it, another feast. It's bigger than Thanksgiving, one of the American guards told Wilhelm during a work detail. Christmas dinner is the big one. Turkey again, probably ham too. All the trimmings. Wilhelm didn't quite believe it. Thanksgiving had been remarkable enough. Surely that was a special exception, a once-yearly display. They wouldn't do it again so soon. But on December 20th, Lieutenant Wells began organizing. Additional food shipments arrived. The mess hall was decorated with pine branches in paper chains made by prisoners during craft hour. A small tree appeared in the corner, decorated with handmade ornaments. "This is insane," Ernst said, watching the preparations. "They're spending resources on decorations." "For prisoners. Maybe that's the point," Wilhelm replied. "Maybe they're showing us something." "Showing us what?" "That they can afford to." Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. The mess hall opened at 6 in the evening, earlier than usual. The prisoners filed in, and once again they stopped at the entrance, stunned by what they saw. If Thanksgiving had been abundant, Christmas was overwhelming. The serving line held not one turkey, but multiple turkeys. And beside them, glazed hams, their surfaces sticky with honey and cloves. Roasted chickens. Prime rib, pink in the center, carved to order. The sides were equally abundant. Not just potatoes, but multiple kinds of potatoes. Candied yams, regular mashed. Roasted new potatoes with rosemary. Vegetables in varieties Wilhelm couldn't name. Salads, breads, rolls, cornbread, biscuits, and desserts. Not just pies this time, but cakes, cookies, puddings, something the guards called fruitcake that looked dense and dark and smelled of spices. The prisoners moved through the line in silence, plates filling, minds struggling to process what they were seeing. This wasn't just a meal. This was a statement. This was America saying, "Look what we have. Look what we can give. Look how different this is from what you knew." Wilhelm loaded his plate with ham and turkey, potatoes and yams, vegetables he couldn't name. He found his usual seat, Ernst across from him as always, and they began to eat. But this time, something was different. Guards moved through the mess hall, carrying small wrapped packages. They placed one at each prisoner's seat, simple packages, wrapped in brown paper, tied with string. Wilhelm stared at his package. No one had given him a gift in 4 years. "Open them," Sergeant Holland called out. "Merry Christmas." Wilhelm untied the string carefully, not wanting to damage it. Inside the paper, he found a bar of chocolate, American chocolate, sweeter than German varieties, a pack of cigarettes, a small notebook and pencil, a pair of wool socks, and a letter printed in both English and German. "To our prisoners this Christmas season, we know you are far from home and family. We know this is a difficult time. These small gifts are given in the spirit of the season, with hope that someday, When this war ends, we can all return to being neighbors rather than enemies. Merry Christmas from the soldiers and staff of Camp Concordia. Wilhelm read the letter twice. Then he set it down carefully and picked up the chocolate bar. He broke off a square and placed it in his mouth, letting it melt slowly on his tongue. The sweetness was almost painful after months of limited sugar. Across from him, Ernst had opened his package. He held the wool socks, staring at them as if they were made of gold. "My socks have holes," he said quietly. "I've been wearing socks with holes for 8 months, and they gave us new ones. For Christmas." His voice cracked on the last word. Around them, other prisoners examined their gifts. Some were crying openly now, tears running down faces weathered by war and captivity. Others sat in silence, holding chocolate bars or cigarettes or simple wool socks, their expressions unreadable. Wilhelm looked around the mess hall and saw something he would remember for the rest of his life. 300 German soldiers, men who had fought for a regime that promised strength through domination, sitting in an American prison camp, weeping over Christmas gifts from their captors. The meal continued. Men ate slowly, savoring not just the food, but the strangeness of the moment. American guards sat among them, eating the same dinner, opening their own small packages. The gifts were universal, given to everyone in camp regardless of uniform. "This is the part I can't explain," Wilhelm said quietly, speaking to Ernst, but really speaking to himself. "The food, fine. Geneva Convention requires adequate nutrition. The decorations, maybe that's just American excess. But the gifts, the personal touches, the letter hoping we become neighbors someday?" He shook his head. "That's not required. That's a choice. Maybe they're trying to convert us," Ernst suggested. "Make us grateful, compliant. Maybe. Or maybe they actually believe what they wrote. That after the war, we should be neighbors." The idea seemed impossible. They were enemies. They had fought each other, tried to destroy each other. Wilhelm had friends who died fighting Americans. Americans had friends who died fighting Germans. How do you become neighbors after that? But sitting in this mess hall, eating ham and turkey, holding a chocolate bar given freely by men who had every reason to hate him, Wilhelm began to think maybe it wasn't impossible. Maybe it was just difficult. And maybe America was wealthy enough, confident enough, strong enough to try difficult things. After dinner, something unexpected happened. The camp chaplain, Father Michael O'Brien, stood at the front of the mess hall. For those who wished to attend, he announced in accented but serviceable German, "We're holding Christmas Eve services in the chapel at 2100 hours. Catholic Mass, Protestant worship, both available. All are welcome." Wilhelm hadn't been to church in years. The regime had discouraged religious observance, and then the war had made it impossible. But that night, he found himself walking to the small chapel the Americans had established in a converted storage building. The room was full. German prisoners filled the wooden benches, Catholic and Protestant sitting together, some who believed, and many who weren't sure they believed anymore, but wanted the comfort of familiar rituals. Father O'Brien conducted Mass in Latin, the universal language that transcended borders. Wilhelm, who had been raised Catholic, but had drifted away, found himself remembering the responses, the rhythms, the comfort of words unchanged by war. During communion, the chaplain served bread and wine to anyone who came forward. Wilhelm hesitated, then joined the line. When he knelt before Father O'Brien, the priest looked at him with eyes full of something Wilhelm couldn't quite name. Not pity, not judgment, something closer to sadness mixed with hope. "The body of Christ," Father O'Brien said in German, placing the wafer on Wilhelm's tongue. Wilhelm returned to his seat and closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. The service ended near midnight. Men filed out into the cold December night, breath visible in the frigid air, stars bright overhead. They walked back to the barracks in small groups, speaking quietly or not at all. In his bunk that night, Wilhelm couldn't sleep. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day. The food, the gifts, the service, the chaplain's expression, the letter hoping they could become neighbors. For the first time since capture, he felt something shift inside him, not just a crack in the wall, but a crumbling, a fundamental questioning of everything he'd believed about enemies and strength and what made a nation powerful. Germany had promised victory through domination, through discipline and sacrifice, and the willingness to be harder than everyone else. They would win because they were willing to do what others wouldn't, to deprive, to push, to demand more from their people and their soldiers than any nation had demanded before. But America was winning, and they were doing it while feeding their prisoners turkey and ham, while giving chocolate bars and wool socks to men who had fought against them, while holding Christmas services for enemy soldiers, while treating captivity not as punishment, but as temporary custody of human beings who would someday need to be reintegrated into the world. It was a different kind of strength. Not the strength of deprivation, but the strength of abundance. Not the strength of cruelty, but the strength of mercy. And it was defeating Germany more thoroughly than any battlefield victory could. The next morning, Christmas Day, breakfast was simpler, but still generous pancakes, bacon, coffee, orange juice. Wilhelm ate mechanically, still processing the previous night. Ernst joined him at the table. Did you go to the service? Yes. What was it like? Familiar, strange, sad. Wilhelm paused. Hopeful, maybe. I don't know what to believe anymore, Ernst said quietly. Everything we were told about America, about the enemy, about what happened if we were captured, it's all wrong. Not exaggerated. Wrong. Wilhelm nodded. He felt the same way. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. How do you reconcile propaganda with reality when reality keeps insisting on being decent? Over the following weeks, life in Camp Concordia returned to normal routines. Work details resumed. The decorations came down. The weather turned bitter cold, and prisoners spent more time indoors, playing cards, reading, writing letters to families they hoped still existed. But something had changed. The Thanksgiving feast had been remarkable. The Christmas celebration had been transformative. Together, they had accomplished what no amount of re-education or propaganda could achieve. They had made German soldiers question not just their military strategy, but their entire worldview. Wilhelm wrote another letter to Anna in January 1944. I don't know if my previous letters reached you. I don't know if this one will. But I need to write this down, to put words to what I'm experiencing. The Americans are not what we were told. They're winning this war, but not through the means we expected. They're not starving us. They're not brutalizing us. They're not even particularly angry at us, though they have every reason to be. Instead, they're doing something more insidious and more powerful. They're treating us like human beings. They feed us well. They give us medical care. They pay us for our work. At Thanksgiving and Christmas, they gave us feasts that were better than anything I ate in Germany, even before the war. And I think that's the point. They're showing us that their system democracy, capitalism, whatever you want to call it, works better than ours ever did. Not through speeches or force, but through simple demonstration. Look, they're saying, look how we treat even our enemies. Imagine how we treat our own people. It's devastating, Anna. More devastating than any defeat on the battlefield. Because it makes me wonder what we were fighting for, what we believed in, whether any of it was worth the cost. I hope you're alive. I hope you're safe. I hope when this war ends, we can be together again. And I hope Germany learns from what happened here, not just that we lost, but why we lost. Because I'm beginning to understand, and the answer isn't what I expected. He didn't mail that letter either. Some truths were too dangerous to commit to paper that might be read by authorities. But he kept it, folded in his notebook, along with a Christmas letter from Camp Concordia. Physical evidence that this strange experience had actually happened. That American soldiers had given him wool socks and chocolate and hoped that enemies could become neighbors. The war continued. Months passed. Wilhelm remained at Camp Concordia through 1944 and into 1945. He worked farm details in the spring and summer, helped with harvest in the fall, spent another winter in the barracks, learning English from guards who were surprisingly patient teachers. Thanksgiving 1944 brought another feast. Christmas 1944 brought more gifts, this time hand-knitted scarves made by local church groups, along with the chocolate and cigarettes and small necessities. Each feast, each gift, each moment of unexpected kindness added another crack to the wall, until the wall wasn't a wall anymore, but a pile of rubble, and Wilhelm could see clearly what lay on the other side. The regime's propaganda had promised that strength came from hardness, that mercy was weakness, that abundance made people soft. But America had demonstrated the opposite. Their abundance made them stronger. Their mercy didn't weaken them. Their willingness to treat even enemies decently wasn't softness. It was confidence. They were so sure they would win that they could afford to be generous. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Wilhelm remained at Camp Concordia for months afterward, waiting for repatriation arrangements. During that time, he received his first letter from Anna in nearly 2 years. She was alive, living with her sister in the countryside near Hamburg. The city was ruins, but she had survived. "Come home when you can," she wrote. "We'll rebuild." "Everyone here is rebuilding." Wilhelm wrote back immediately. He told her about Camp Concordia, about the food and the work, and the strange kindness of American soldiers. He told her about Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners, about wool socks and chocolate bars, about a chaplain who served communion to enemy soldiers. "I'm not the same person who left," he wrote. "The war changed me, but not in the ways I expected. I learned things here that they never taught us in Germany, about strength and mercy, about what makes a nation powerful, about how you treat people, even enemies, when you're confident in your own values. I'm coming home, Anna, but I'm bringing these lessons with me. And maybe, if enough of us bring them home, Germany can become something different, something better." He was repatriated in October 1945, nearly 2 years after his first Thanksgiving in America. The journey back was long and complicated, trains and trucks and temporary camps. When he finally arrived in Hamburg, the devastation was worse than he'd imagined. Buildings reduced to rubble, streets barely passable, people thin and hollow-eyed, moving through ruins like ghosts. Anna met him at the Displaced Persons Center. She was thinner than he remembered, older somehow, but alive. They held each other in silence. Too much to say, no words adequate for what they'd both survived. That night, in the single room they shared in her sister's partially destroyed house, Anna asked him about America, about captivity, about what it was like. Wilhelm tried to explain, about Camp Concordia and Sergeant Holland and Lieutenant Wells, about turkey dinners and chocolate bars and wool socks given as Christmas gifts, about a chaplain who believed enemies could become neighbors. "They treated you better than our own forces treated us," Anna said quietly. "We were starving while you ate turkey." The guilt Wilhelm felt at those words was crushing. He had been fed while his wife starved. He had received gifts while his country burned. He had been shown mercy while civilians at home suffered. But he also understood something Anna didn't yet see. The same abundance that fed him had helped defeat Germany. The same system that gave prisoners chocolate bars had built the ships and planes and tanks that won the war. The same confidence that allowed Americans to treat enemies decently had given them the strength to fight a war on 2 fronts and win both. They won because they could afford to be generous, Wilhelm said. Because their system worked so well, they had surplus to spare, even for prisoners, even for enemies. And what does that mean for us? Anna asked. It means we rebuild. And maybe, if we're smart, we learn from them. We build something that works. Something that creates abundance instead of demanding sacrifice. Something that's strong enough to be merciful. It was an idealistic notion, probably impossible in the ruins of 1945 Germany. But Wilhelm had eaten Thanksgiving dinner in a Kansas prison camp. He had received Christmas gifts from soldiers who should have hated him. He had experienced the transformative power of unexpected kindness. If that was possible, maybe anything was. Years later, in the 1960s, Wilhelm returned to America. Not as a prisoner this time, but as an immigrant. He brought Anna and their 2 children, born in the difficult years of Reconstruction. He found work as an engineer in Ohio, bought a house in a suburb, learned to navigate American life. Every Thanksgiving, he cooked turkey. Every Christmas, he gave thoughtful gifts. His children, American-born in spirit if not in fact, never quite understood why these holidays mattered so much to their father, why he always cooked too much food, why he always gave more gifts than necessary. He tried to explain once, when his daughter was old enough to understand. "These holidays saved me," he said. "Not my life. The Americans would have kept me alive regardless. But my soul. They showed me that enemies could be treated with dignity, that abundance was strength, not weakness. That mercy was possible even in war." His daughter didn't fully understand. How could she? She had never been hungry, never been captive, never experienced the dissolution of certainty that comes when reality contradicts everything you believed. But Wilhelm understood. And every Thanksgiving and Christmas, he remembered. He remembered Sergeant Holland grinning at the mess hall door. He remembered Lieutenant Wells organizing feasts for prisoners. He remembered Father O'Brien serving communion to German soldiers. He remembered wool socks and chocolate bars and a letter hoping enemies could become neighbors. He remembered, and he was grateful. Not just for the food, though that mattered. Not just for surviving, though that mattered too. But for the lesson embedded in those holiday feasts, that the strong can afford to be generous, that mercy doesn't require weakness, that even in war, humanity was possible. Those Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners in Camp Concordia hadn't just fed 300 German prisoners. They had taught them something more valuable than any meal. They had shown them what kind of nation America was not through propaganda or speeches, but through the simple act of sharing abundance with enemies. And that lesson, more than any battlefield victory, had transformed them, had made them question, doubt, reconsider, and ultimately understand that the world they'd been promised in Germany was a lie, and the world they'd feared in America was actually something closer to hope. That's what those holiday dinners meant. Not just food, though food was part of it, but transformation. The slow, meal-by-meal dissolution of propaganda, replaced by the undeniable reality of turkey and ham and chocolate bars given freely to men who were supposed to be enemies. It was the most American thing Wilhelm ever experienced, and it changed him forever.